Good morning. My name is Cliff Thompson, and I am Region 2 historian. This morning, October the 12th, 1995, we are visiting with John Fox, Society President in 1962 and 1963, at his home on Lake Ontario near Bowmanville, Ontario. Thank you, John, very much for meeting with us this morning. Before we get to your presidential years, perhaps we could review your years in high school and university and how they affected your final choice of being in the air conditioning business.
Well, my early school was Central Technical School in Toronto, with the course directed to a Faculty of Applied Science in Toronto. I was there in graduated in 1919. So that was a pre-selected course to the university. I happened to be too young to go right on, so I took time out to get some money, which I was in desperate need of. What else do you want to know about my early school? I'm a University of Toronto graduate in engineering, and there was a struggle to get through financial.
What course did you take, John?
I took what they called at that time civil hydraulics, and the not only civil was a broad scope course, but the hydraulics was very much in vogue at the time when the Niagara power plants were being put into effect, and that's why the hydraulics came in. It was a broad-ranging course which I've never regretted having taken.
John, after you left university, how did you start your business and ASHRAE career?
As you know, I stayed a year after graduation on demonstrating into the labs and to do research on welding. Then when I was joined with the Dunham Company at the time, they wanted a projectionist, but they wouldn't buy a membership, so I projected for a couple of years at the Toronto chapter and for all the speakers. It was very interesting, got introduced. But it wasn't until I moved to Honeywell in 1931, 34, when the first move they made was to get me to join Toronto chapter, which was my starting career. That was in 34.
In 1938, Holt Gurney became the first Canadian to be president of our society. Did you know him, and can you tell us something about him?
Yes, I knew Holt very well. He was the president of the Gurney Foundry, which made cast iron radiation and boilers, and he was the one who instigated bringing the annual meeting to Canada for the first time, which went up to Big Gwenin. He was quite a character, and very much of an influential man and a true Canadian.
John, how did you spend the Second World War years?
Oh,
I understand.
How did I spend it? Dodging the bombs. In September the 15th, 39, I was tested into what was then the engineering section of the Ordnance Corps and told to go home and relax. And then I put on my uniform on Boxing Day of 1939. and was overseas in January 1940. And from there on, it was shuttling back and forth between Canada and continental Europe, which spent the last 14 months active in Antwerp, enjoying the buzz bombs and the stuff that Fritz decided to throw at us.
I understand that you received the Order of the British Empire from King George VI.
Should I tell you what it's really called? Other buggers' efforts, we don't know why you get it, but I did enjoy going to Buckingham Palace, and I was on the last installation of King George VI.
After the war, you returned to Honeywell, and your business and ASHRAE career started in earnest. What can you tell us about it?
I got home on a Friday night, and Tom McDonald had heard that I was back. Of course, Tom lost two brothers in the show, and he got hold of me. And he said, "When are you coming back to work?" And this was on Friday. He said, "I want to see you on Monday." I said, "Tom, I have no clothes." He said, "What's wrong with what you're wearing?" So I went back to Honeywell, and that'll be in February of 1954. 45, yeah.
John, in 1949, you were chairman of the Ontario chapter, as the Toronto chapter was called then, and you also became regional director for Canada. Can you tell us about how all that came about?
Well, when I joined Honeywell, of course, one of the first requirements was that I become active in ASHRAE, or heating and ventilating it was then, and that meant I got into the chairs by invitation or direction, and became elected president in 49. And then I remember well, Nat Hunter came up to Toronto, who was then a vice president of heating and ventilating, and he suggested that I go on to become a regional director. And at that time, the region was all of Canada from coast to coast, which was quite a bit of geography. So I arranged with Honeywell for the directors to authorize me to take on the office, which I did, and that was a 3-year appointment. So by 52, I was finishing my year, and at the same time, I was becoming active in the Association of Professional Engineers of Ontario, and in a short while, I became president of that, and at the same time was regional director. So it was a busy life.
John, what can you tell us about the merger with ASRE?
Well, as you well know, ASRE was involved with refrigeration, ice making, and the preservation of foods. And in other words, it was not for comfort, it was an industrial operation, whereas the heating and ventilating was concerned with environmental things and personal comfort. So, but there were enough people that had a dual membership, and they decided they better to get together and hold their meetings, joint meetings and one thing or the other, and refrigeration was coming in to be part of air conditioning. So it was a natural thing that the two groups would merge. it had some interesting repercussions. For instance, I had to hightail it off to Chicago to placate the people in the RE branch in South Chicago who were chiefly concerned with slaughterhouses and things of that, the meat preservation, whereas the Illinois chapter uptown was concerned with environmental things, comfort and personal things of that kind. The deal we made right off the top of my head was, you fellows have a good chapter and all the rest of it, carry on. And then I told the Illinois people the same thing, you carry on. Then I had to come back to the board and say I've made a deal. So what's the deal? Well, there'd be a chapter in South Chicago, and a chapter uptown. And that meant that the society had to authorize 2 or 3 places that could have 2 chapters that would not merged. One was Chicago, one was St. Louis, and one was New Jersey. So we got through it at that, got a merger agreement. 80% of the people were in favor of it.
John, how would you describe your presidential year?
Well, my presidential year of the National Society,
Yes,
I would consider it satisfactory. I am the sole survivor of the original negotiators, and looking back, I don't see many things we could have changed. It meant a busy time for me traveling. I had to, from coast to coast, and I guess what you were PR, public relations, very actively, but it worked, and it's now been going for over 30 years. So I think it was a good deal.
You left Honeywell in 1967,
Yeah.
but you didn't retire. What are the different involvements you got into after?
See, the rules of Honeywell, the retirement scheme, where you had to retire at the year closest to your 65th year. And that happened, it was 67 for me. So I went from that to a good friend of mine in the engineering business, Nick Fodor. And I stayed with Nick for about 4 years and traveled all over the world promoting things like slaughterhouses, airfields. We're in the Himalayas 1 minute and the Hawaii another. It was an interesting time for 4 years. And Nick happened to have a large contract with the Toronto Post Office, and I could see this thing I was in coming to an end. So I negotiated a deal to go to the post office and look after Nick's interests. So I went to the post office for what looked like 2 or 3 weeks or months, and I ended up for 6 years at the post office. So that's the way I started a retirement.
And after you left the post office, you became involved with the Ontario Department of Energy and the churches.
Oh, yes, I was at the Department of Energy. They had a proposal that would permit me to make a complete survey of their environmental situations and make a recommendation, and the Ontario government would pay for it. Department of Energy. The cost was usually around $200 or $300 per visit. But one of my clients at that time was Harmony United Church in Oshawa, and we made a recommendation that would cost them about $14,000, which they put into effect. And then the first year they saved 17, so I guess it was a good deal. And incidentally, there are about 75 religious denominations available. Some of them, there's Christian, Muslim, the whole heap of them, 75. And I learned where to put on my hat and take off my shoes as I went around. There are over 2,000 churches in Ontario, and I had a clientele of about 300. So it was fairly interesting. There are 20,000 churches, synagogues, and so on in Canada, and about 10% of them in Ontario. Now, that program has fallen by the wayside. The government had no money for it, and the churches had no money to pay me for it, so it just gradually folded up. And I closed my Toronto office, moved down here to Bowmanville, and was uptown office for about 3 or 4 years. And a year ago, I closed the uptown office and opened a little one as an adjunct of my home here at the lake. So that's what happened. Kind of a busy retirement.
John, for more years than even I care to remember, you have been inducting the new officers of the Toronto chapter. Can you tell us how that all came about?
Well, I was installed in 61 or 62 in Miami, and the boys down there, up to that time, they had just said, come on here, you're sitting at the head table now. Some of the boys, my contemporaries, said we can do better than that. So they established a ritual, of which I was the first victim. And a lot of it was based on certain well-established fraternities. And so I was installed formally by my peers and friends. The next year, we carried that on and checked in my successor. Well, 2 years later, I was invited by Toronto chapter to install the new officers. Naturally, I just turned up the old ritual and put it into effect. We carried that on for 30 years. And last year was the first year of which I haven't installed the Ontario Toronto chapter officers. It's kind of a miss, but I guess it's getting older.
John, on behalf of the Toronto chapter, I want to thank you for that. And maybe now, John, how would you summarize your engineering life, and what sort of advice and comments would you give to young engineers coming up in the HVAC and R business?
Well, first of all, life has been exciting and most rewarding, and I basically have no complaints. I'm not a millionaire, but I have a lot of satisfaction. I lived through 2 depressions, a war, and I've always been able to keep myself busy. You can't be too choosy what you do, but you can pick something and you start to get enjoyment out of it. If it doesn't give you satisfaction one way, probably something else will turn up. But I've found life twists and turns, and I no sooner turn from something, I find something else to do. And if I can't farm here, raise apples, I can do something else. So keep yourself busy, keep your mind active, And if you're blessed with good health, what more can you ask?
John, on behalf of Region 2, on behalf of society, we want to thank you very much for spending this time with us this morning and wish you many more years of happy retirement.
Thank you.